events in the Amherst community, but we are continuing our efforts virtually for the time being. We would like to thank our funders, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Program, the Graduate Student Senate, the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our generous UMass Gives donors. If you have a quick moment as we get started, please fill out the survey that we've linked in the chat. It's super short, it shouldn't take more than a few seconds, and through that link, you can also subscribe to our mailing list to stay tuned for future cafes. All right, and with that, today we are very excited to continue our 10th anniversary theme of welcoming back past Life Science Cafe members. We are particularly excited to have Lian Guo here with us to talk about fish ecophysiology and the impacts of climate change. Lian is currently a PhD candidate in the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology program at UMass Amherst, and will be defending her dissertation in December. Lian was involved with Science Cafe for 5 years, including 2 years as president. So thanks for joining us, Lian.
Thanks for having me. Super excited to be here. Also, of course, a little nervous. I feel like I haven't done public speaking in a while, but I'm ready. Hey,
it's going to be great. All right, let's go ahead and get started with a quick audience poll or quiz. I believe we have a question queued up and ready to go, so let's go ahead and put that out there. So the question is, I'll just go ahead and read it. What % of fish consumed in the United States is imported? And you've got a couple of options there. Take a moment to think about it, see what you think matches, and we'll give you the answers in just a moment. Oh, and it looks like we've also got the 2 truths and a fish lie that's out there as well. So we'll hold back on the answer for that one until a little bit later in the talk, but you can go ahead and take a guess on which of these things did not happen to Lian. We'll give you just another few seconds if you're still thinking about it. All right, we'll wrap it up. So 53% of you, just over half of you got it correct. It was indeed 80%. And with that, I will turn things over to Lian.
Sure, I can share the answer in a little more depth, I guess. You share my screen. So it seems like we have an audience who's very in the know. It is shocking how much of our food actually comes from not North America or the United States. So this graph, which hopefully you can see, Will, tell me if you don't see it.
I can see it just fine. It looks great.
Okay, great. So you can see all of these arrows are showing you where our seafood is coming from around the world. So most of it is coming from Asia, and only about 16% is from North America coming back to ourselves. So I think this is really important for us to recognize that when we think about fish populations and where we're getting our seafood, that this is really a global issue. And that's important to think about when we're talking about climate change impacts as well. So nice work, everybody.
Yeah, well done, everyone who got that right. And so this, I think, does a really great job at showing just how broad the effects of fish are, how important they are to people. So do you have kind of a number of what proportion of people around the world rely on fish as a regular source of protein or for jobs or anything like that?
Yeah, so a lot of people are really familiar with fish as something that's, on your dinner plate or in an aquarium. And I think we often forget that fish provide so many more services than just that. I like to have kind of this be an image that I think of in that fish provide So many things. We eat them as protein for nutrients. Everyone talks about omega-3s being super healthy for us in our diets, right? So it's an incredibly important source of protein around the world. And it creates a lot of jobs. So people who actually go and catch those fish to put them on your dinner plates, people who have tourism, so visiting coral reefs. Coral reefs aren't as beautiful if there aren't fish on them. And so there's a whole industry around tourism, fisheries, and also aquaculture. So rearing fish for people to eat and for restoration purposes. And I think it's also important to recognize that there are also some really important cultural practices that in fishing, whether it's recreational or traditional indigenous fishing for sustenance, those are all really important direct impacts to humans. And then there's also indirect things. So the fact that there are 34,000 different species of fish around the world, that's an incredible source of biodiversity for our aquatic ecosystems. And the nutrients and energy from those fish also feed into our ecosystems to keep them healthy and resilient with time as time goes on. So just some like numbers to answer your question. 1 billion people every day rely on fish as a source of protein. The whole world, there are 250 million people who rely on fish for their jobs. And in tourism, that also contributes about $161 billion to the world's global economy. So if you're a numbers person, like I hope this convinces you, fish are really important and valuable.
Yeah, those are some pretty amazing statistics. So fish are clearly really important globally, but they're also threatened on a global scale. And you hinted at this a minute ago that the impacts of climate change are having some effects on fish. Can you talk about that a little bit more? What are some of these diverse effects that climate change is having on the world's fish populations?
Sure. So there's a number of different things, some of which are also occurring in other species, not just fishes. But one thing that has been observed is that as climate change occurs and temperatures become more variable or warmer, that we're generally just seeing less fish. And there is not really a good reason why or a good mechanism identified yet as to why there's less abundant fish populations with climate change, but we sure know the consequences of that, right? If there's less fish, that's less money for the fisheries and tourism industry. There's less protein for our growing global population. So that's definitely a concerning aspect and requires more study, of course. And I think another impact that I'm going to focus on a little bit more is a change in where fish are and when they're in those locations. And so I'm going to share my screen again. What I mean by that is that across the world, there are fish populations distributed along the coasts, off the coast in the high seas, and we've kind of been able to predict where those fish would be just based on historically where they've been found and where they're able to live. But what we're seeing on a global scale is that fish populations with warmer temperatures are starting to shift toward the poles. So fish that are off the east coast of the United States, that would mean they're going north toward Maine, for example. So there's been a couple of studies, which this is just a figure which kind of summarizes that, where they looked at 75 different studies off of the North Atlantic coast in the last few decades. And they found that 84% of those species have either begun to move north or they've begun to move deeper. And so moving north and moving deeper means that those fish are following colder waters. And so they're trying to escape those warming waters where they used to live. And so if you think about this from the perspective of, for example, someone who has a fishing company, those fish that all of your boats and the gear that you have on your boats, you bought all of that specifically to catch certain species of fish. As those fish move farther and farther away from your historical fishing grounds, you're going to have to spend more time out at sea to catch those fish. You're probably going to catch less of them because of those climate change impacts I mentioned earlier. And all of that is just to say that it's going to become less and less productive, less money for someone who's trying to catch those fish over time. And that's really concerning for our fishing communities, as far as how we can make sure that they are able to maintain jobs, maintain livelihoods, in the event of climate change affecting those populations of fish that they like to catch. And this is kind of complicated because it's not like climate change is affecting every single fish in exactly the same way. So I just want to give this example because I think it's really interesting. These little graphs here show you where fish have been distributed by latitude. So over temperatures. So over time, we're seeing that fish, as winter temperatures increase, they're actually moving farther north. And these are 3 different species which occur in the North Sea. So Atlantic cod, anglerfish, which a lot of people have seen in like Finding Nemo, and snake blenny. And so you'll see that the slope of these lines are different. So snake blenny has moved much farther north than Atlantic cod have. And so if you think about an ecosystem and the fact that normally they all interact with each other a certain way, and now some of them are moving kind of slowly, some of them are moving really fast, that's going to cause some really complex issues and interactions for the ecologies of each of these fish. And I think that is like an incredible challenge for ecologists moving forward, because how can you ever predict what's going to happen when you have all of these organisms shifting at different rates with climate change? So I just wanted to mention like that complexity because I think it's so intriguing and also kind of scary for me as a as a fish scientist.
That's crazy how far these fish are moving. Do we have any sense of why temperature is such a large driver of these movements?
Yes, well, temperature is kind of known as the master controller factor because it basically controls the rate of biochemical processes. And that's not just in fish, you know, that's in bacteria and you and me and birds. And so in that way, everything that functions in your body really depends on temperature. And so the proteins that work in your cells, they typically have evolved over time to function at a certain temperature. And this usually makes a little bit more sense for some people. In humans, we regulate our temperature to be the same all the time. And so the proteins in our cells and tissues, they all typically function really well at that body temperature of what, 96.8 or whatever it is, right? Like that's what they're optimized to perform at. But once you start moving your body temperature into really hot and really cold, so we're talking about hyper and hypothermia, we're all aware, most people are aware that you start to shut down, right? When it's too cold, your body doesn't function anymore. And that comes from your biomolecules in your body no longer able to function at that temperature. And so fish don't actually regulate their body temperature, but it works in a similar way where their cells like to work they work better at certain temperatures. And these we sometimes call like their optimal thermal tolerance or their optimal thermal breadth. That's where they've evolved over time to do well at. And so once you start shifting the temperature around them to other temperatures, which are kind of outside of that optimal breadth, it starts to reduce their rate of growth. It means they might have lower reproductive rates, lower survival, even if it gets really extreme temperatures. And so you can kind of see over time how just a change in temperature can kind of lead to these small cumulative effects occurring where you do actually have populations which aren't growing as well or actually dying under extreme circumstances. So temperature, it affects everything about, you know, fish's ecology. And then if you add the ecology on top of that, so then if their predators are being affected, if their prey is being affected, those are indirect effects that are then going to come together with those temperature effects to really create like a potentially challenging situation for them moving forward. So I'm speaking a little bit vaguely, but hopefully in a way that, you know, makes sense to people who aren't as familiar with this idea of like thermal physiology.
Sure. Yeah. So one of the words we've now thrown out a couple of times is physiology. Can you define that for us just so we're on the same page moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, another kind of vague definition, but physiology is a very, very broad field of study. And it really is just the study of how an organism or a body unit functions. And so some people study, you know, molecular biology, and that's technically within ecology, within physiology as well, because you're understanding in the whole spectrum, how does an organism function? So it's kind of a straightforward, simple answer to that.
Sure, and we can get into some more of the details in a few minutes here, but one more definition real quick, and this is something that will make a little bit more sense as we get into the details of your research, but what is anadromy?
Yeah, so anadromy, we're talking about this because the species I study is anadromous. So being anadromous is a life history strategy that a small subset of fish in the world use. And essentially it means that a fish spends most of its adult life in the ocean, and then it will actually migrate into fresh water, so rivers, ponds, lakes, as long as they're accessible, to then lay their offspring. So lay their eggs. The eggs then live in those nursery habitats for a certain amount of time, and then they will come back out to the ocean to become sexually mature adults. So it's a life history strategy that is not super common, but some of the fish that you might be familiar with would be salmon. That's a really popular one that people know. Like salmon are adults out in the ocean, they come into rivers, have their babies, and often people will catch them during that migration or out at sea for eating. And some of the more local examples would be American shad, river herring, which is a species I study, and then striped bass.
Great. Well, that wraps up our first batch of questions, our first vignette. So we'll take a few minutes to do a question and answer segment right now. So if you're in the audience and you have a question for Lian, go ahead and put that in the Q&A part of Zoom. So there should be a little button that says Q&A at the bottom of your screen. You can go ahead and type in your question, and we'll go ahead and get some of those answered here in a minute. All right, we've got a raised hand. So I'll go, and we're going to give Abigail the chance to ask a question. If I can figure out how Zoom works.
Yeah.
Oh, we had you for a minute and then we lost you.
Here we go. Hi, I hope you're doing well out there. I miss you, and I'm so glad you're doing all this stuff. Can I come to your dissertation, please? That's not the question, but answer that too. Anyways, I was thinking while you were talking about like all the fish moving deeper underwater to deal with the increased temperatures, it made me kind of wonder if there's any literature about like herbivorous fish having an especially tough time with that, because I'm thinking if they're eating all these plants floating on the surface of the water and they need that sun to photosynthesize, but then those plants kind of can't function below that. I wonder if that's just a thing that people have found. I'm so happy to be here.
So for some context, yeah, Abigail is my previous undergrad. It's so nice to see her. I owe you some stuff. I'm just remembering now. So hi, nice to see you. You are welcome to come to my defense, of course. That is a great question. So herbivory for fish can also mean that they're eating zooplankton. And so there are zooplankton that will go deeper. That's a really good question, though. I think what you're getting at, of course, is that plants and zooplankton only exist at certain depths, right? And so, and they do sometimes, the zooplankton will migrate, sometimes they'll change depths. So it's really important to consider how climate's also impacting them and whether fish are going to be following where they are or where they're going to be following where the temperature is, or some combination of those two. And so there's a lot of potential for mismatches in this area. And I think that's a really important question and a really important area of research that I think we're not even, there may be some examples out there, but I can't think of one where they really did a good job exploring that. And I'll just put kind of like I don't know, a note out there to the world that studying fish in the ocean is just so hard. You have to have ships. You can just imagine how much area 70% of the world is and how deep the ocean is. It is so challenging to study any of these questions, much more so than on land. And so some of these questions, which we have like pretty figured out on land, are just technically very challenging to study in the ocean. And I think now with some autonomous technology that people are developing, like sail drones, that hopefully we can start to reduce the costs of answering these kinds of questions. But it's going to take time and innovation and people to join the field and become researchers and innovators. So thank you for that question. I know I probably didn't answer it, but.
No, you're so good. That was great. Email me when your defense is going to be, because I want to be there.
Okay, I will. Thank you.
All right, great. We have one more question. Isn't overfishing killing a lot of fish? Is that one of the main conservation concerns that we've seen?
So overfishing is definitely a very big concern around the world. It's occurring at different rates around the world, and it's different for each species. So I wouldn't say that every single species is definitely being overfished. There have been some pretty outlandish statistics being put out there, but it is important to note that yes, overfishing is a really big conservation concern. And when you're thinking about things like the impacts of climate change or habitat degradation, that by overfishing, you're potentially really reducing the number of fish that are available in a population to build resilience, build adaptability to things like climate change or ocean acidification. So it is definitely a big concern, and I guess I won't I won't speak to it a whole lot more than that, but it is a good reason to look up, sustainable species for eating fish, and we might talk about that a little bit later. Yeah.
Great. Well, that question makes a great transition into our next batch of questions, or our next vignette. So we've talked now about several major conservation concerns. We've talked about habitat degradation, we've talked about climate change, now a little bit about overfishing. How have these different conservation concerns shaped the questions that you've asked for your research?
Well, I think I've had a lot of curiosity about how physiological impacts can affect a fish population, because in the world of fisheries research, which is studying those fish populations which are targeted typically for consumption, we often are looking at the presence and absence of fish and whether they're just here or there, how many there are, and we're not necessarily thinking so much about physiological differences between populations. So how well are they growing? How much reproduction are they having? Do they have enough energy reserves to be doing growth and reproducing? And there is some of that studying going on. But I think in the realm of like climate impacts, it is super important to think about how small changes in growth rates and energy condition can potentially come together to have really big impacts on a fish population. And it could even explain the reason why we see fish moving from where they used to live, just because they're trying to optimize their growth rates or reproductive rates. So I think that idea of like really exploring physiology as a potential mechanism for those climate change impacts was really intriguing to me. And I also really like to think about multiple stressors. So when you're doing experimental research, people often try to make it as controlled as possible. And sometimes they only look at one thing. So how does temperature affect this fish? Not necessarily trying to think about the ecological context. So what about when they have more or less food? What about when there's also not very much oxygen? These are hard to study in an experimental sense because you have to have so many more tanks and so many more fish to study them. But I think it's really important that if we're going to apply what we learned in the lab to the field, that you start to think about those more complicated questions. So those are some things I wanted to think about specifically in application to fish that would be important for a conservation context.
So you said a word there that had me questioning another definition. What is a stressor?
So stressors are factors which can cause challenges to normal functioning. So I mentioned earlier, for example, when we're humans or fish are in their like optimal area, that can be true for other things as well. So oxygen, for example, or even, I guess, I don't know, I might get in trouble for answering this question. My advisor might come after me. um, but basically, when you have things that can challenge normal functioning and push you out of those kind of high functioning areas for physiology, that can become a stressor. So a lot of examples I already used, like temperature, oxygen. I think like low food could be a stressor as well. But this is something that can be debated, as I mentioned, what a stressor is. Because sometimes those, like a good temperature can promote a lot of growth. So why would it be called a stressor? But sometimes it can also hurt growth. So that's what it's a stressor.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit more about the species that you specifically study and why you chose that species?
Sure. And now I get to share some more pictures. So I study river herring. There are two species of river herring. There's alewife and blueback. And these are fish which are native to the East Coast of the United States. And they are anadromous, as I mentioned before. So this picture here is of two adult river herring. And I actually have a model, you can see in my little picture, of like, oh no, it's going to get blurred out. But this is my hands. You can see they're about the size of two hands. They're pretty small fish. And that means that they are pretty much like bite-sized for other larger animals. So I did not know anything about river herring before moving to come to graduate school. I'm from California originally. We don't have river herring over there. But as I got to learn about them and their ecology, their conservation history, I really came to care for them very quickly. I mentioned their life history, but the reason that this is important, their life history, is that their populations have gone down pretty drastically compared to historical levels. So once upon a time, they were super abundant. And when they would come upriver, the local tribes were able to catch them and eat them for sustenance. They still do to this day, but they're not nearly as abundant as they once were. And European settlers also would consume river herring for food. And beside that, they would feed a lot of other animals. So you can just imagine, from their time in the ocean into the rivers, all of that time they're being eaten by other animals, birds, raccoons, snapping turtles, even people. So being a fish that is kind of bite-sized but has a lot of energy, a lot of fat and nutrients, it's really critical as what we call a forage fish. And so the fact that their numbers have kind of come down over time was very concerning. So there's kind of these headlines out there from millions to dozens, tough times for river herring in the Connecticut River. And this is kind of the story across the East Coast, where they really have, especially in recent decades, dropped down to very low levels. And there's not a clear reason why. This is, again, something that's debated, but they think that it's a combination of factors from overfishing, being caught as bycatch when people are fishing. So that means they're not trying to catch river herring, but they're catching them when they're trying to catch other fish, and dams as well. So hydropower is a huge thing, especially in the Northeast. And when you put a dam in a river, a fish can no longer go past that dam, right? So for a fish that requires to go upriver in order to have its babies, that is a huge limitation for that fish. And there's, people have installed things to help fish go past them, but the reality is that there's a lot less habitat than there used to be for these fish. And so the fact that they have this really high potential for being a food source for many other organisms, and yet are just having so much trouble recovering because of all of those different factors, made me, want to help contribute to the science that would support their conservation, the restoration. And so that's why I agreed once I learned about them to focus in my dissertation on them.
So what have you been measuring with these fish?
So I've been measuring a number of things. So, I got some other pictures, I guess. This is me with my fish. These are some of the early life stages, eggs and the juveniles, just so you can kind of see the other parts of their life cycle. So for these fish, I like to kind of think about in a kind of a logical way as to why I measure the things I measure before I tell you what I measure about these fish. So if you think about putting yourself into, being a juvenile fish growing up in a small pond off of the Connecticut River, you have to surpass a number of different challenges in order to make it to the ocean to then survive and become an adult, right? So you have to evade predators. You have to be able to actually swim all the way out to the ocean, which can be many miles. And you have to survive winter, which is a pretty food scarce situation. So that means you need to be prepared to survive that. So that's kind of the big picture goal of what a fish has to do in order to get to the ocean and beat those challenges, right? So I wanted to measure things that would actually tell me something about that. And things that help fish survive being eaten, be able to migrate farther and survive winter is growing large, because the bigger you are, the less mouths you can fit into. Being large also will help you swim farther, because I think about a taller person, they walk farther. Same with fish. Bigger fish can swim farther. And then also surviving winter means that you need to have energy reserves on your body. So that means having fat and sometimes protein on your body that you can use when there's not much food to supply all of your basic metabolism and survive the winter. And that is helped by having more energy reserves, but also being bigger, because bigger fish have more energy reserves. So I wanted to basically measure things like growth, size, energy reserves in the fish. Sounds pretty logical at this point, right? So those are some of the basic organismal things that I would measure when I put my fish in my experiments, or when I collected fish out in the field.
And so what were some of your findings? What did your measurements show?
So I can show, I have a couple of results here. So just to give some context, one of the studies that I did was that I put the fish in 2 different temperatures. So one temperature that I thought they would do fairly well at is an optimal temperature for them to be able to grow. And then a temperature that I thought would be really challenging. So 31 degrees Celsius is pretty high. We never see it in the rivers that the fish currently live in the Connecticut River. And so I wanted to put them into those 2 temperatures and see how they would grow. And then I also wanted to give them more or less food. So this graph here shows you the 2 temperatures on the x-axis, and then the 2 different rations. So when I gave them less food down here, and when I gave them more food, and then I just measured how much they would grow on a daily basis. So what you can see is that basically when the fish have less food, they don't grow as fast. You probably could have guessed that, being a human being. And then what was interesting was that when we increased the temperature to that temperature, which you don't normally see, that actually lowered the growth rate as well. So these fish that were at the high temperature and low ration basically didn't grow at all. So you can imagine that in the field, if these fish are in that circumstance of high temperatures, for example, if climate change causes the temperatures to grow even higher than they are now, and not having any food, they're basically not going to grow. And that could have implications if they're not able to get as big during that growing season before they leave to go out into the field. So basically this told me that temperature and food together are really important for these fish. I also measure things like energy density. I don't know if I want to go too much into it, but basically both of these are also really important for how much energy the fish have on their body. And so fish which were at the lower food ration, they had a lower energy density, so less energy on their body to help them, for example, survive winter. But in the high food ration, even though the fish were smaller because they were growing less, they actually were able to put more food on, more energy reserves on their body because they had more food. So again, this kind of tells you these things are complicated, and if you only measure temperature or only measure food availability, it can kind of only give you one side of the picture. So I think it is important that we're looking at more than one of these factors in these experimental studies.
Sure. So what are some of the challenges or maybe weird experiences you've had during your research? And maybe now we can go back to the poll question from the beginning, the two truths and a lie, and we can wrap around and cover that answer.
Yeah. I don't know if we have what the voting results
Yeah, I can.
are.
Here we go. Everyone should be able to see them now.
Ooh,
So,
it's pretty evenly split.
it is.
Yeah, so this research is very challenging because the species has been super understudied. So for a long time, people in the Northeast were really focused on other species, for example, Atlantic salmon, before it became so low in numbers in a lot of the Northeast that it didn't make sense to be trying to bring them back anymore. But there's kind of been a resurgence recently. Regardless, there's not a lot of published research out there about it. And so for me to be able to do experimental studies, it meant that I had to ask the like 2 or 3 people who have actually successfully raised the fish in the lab, how in the world they could do it. Because if you ask most people who work on these fish, they're like, oh, if you look at them, they die. You know, if you touch them, they die. And so it's very, very challenging to keep them alive. And there is that bias in science where if you have a very sturdy species, it's much easier to work on them because you don't have to worry about just keeping them alive. They're always healthy. You can just do your experiments. You can get a lot of publications. So these species, which actually might have more conservation importance or applications, but are hard to keep alive in the lab, there's not a lot of incentive in the research world to actually do research on them. So that was a very big challenge for me to figure out a lot on my own as a grad student. I had to build a lab from the ground up and successfully raise them after several seasons of failure. So it has been very challenging, and I think I got a little burnt out on the work, but it also has been a very rewarding experience, and it's brought around some very interesting experiences. So the 2 truths and a lie, I did have a police officer and a construction worker help carry my fish from a truck into the lab. This happened when a tree fell down in front of our lab, cut all the power source, and I had no way to drive in with my fish. So they all helped me very kindly transport my fish into the lab. I also was given, along with our field team, a mason jar full of Pacific salmon by a recreational fisher. He just enjoyed, I guess, his conversation with us about fishing on the Connecticut River and decided to hand us a jar of salmon he had caught on the West Coast and driven over. And yes, I did try it.
And how was it?
It was good. It was good. But then I was like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have eaten that. I ate enough to not kill me. You know, I wasn't the only one, I promise. And so the lie is that I have only killed 1 cell phone in experimental tanks, and it was a very tragic experience for me.
Stuff. Never a dull day with research.
Yep.
So we'll transition back now into another Q&A segment. So if you have any questions, go ahead and add them to the Q&A function in Zoom. And I believe we have a few here. So are fish affected by increases in carbon dioxide levels due to climate change in any way? So we've touched on this a little bit, but maybe if you just want to recap quickly.
No, it's a good question. I think that question was referring to ocean acidification. So the ocean is a huge sink for carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere. And so it's actually acidifying the ocean over time, and that's called ocean acidification. So this primarily is a concern for calcifying organisms. So you can think of like your mollusks, clams, oysters, mussels, some pteropods, and then corals as well. So I think technically speaking, fish can be affected by ocean acidification, and there have been studies done to look at, for example, especially the larval stages and how they're being affected. I almost was going to do a postdoc potentially on this topic actually, but the results on that have been really conflicting. So in some cases, they do affect development and some they don't. So this is an area that I think requires a lot more research. And of course, fish have bones too. So it's very possible that they could be affected. I think there's just not enough research yet, maybe to say very clearly across the board how fish are going to be affected with that. So good question.
Great. And one more question. Are there any observations of fish adapting to changing conditions rather than migrating away? So sort of making a new subspecies.
It's a great question. So if I had to guess that over evolutionary time, that there are definitely fish species which have diverged into multiple species based on temperature, not necessarily just related to the current rapid climate change, but just in, natural speciation that has occurred over time to help, species which are kind of not overlapping, or new species, that are forming. So I imagine that it has happened. But to say that there is a documented case, I am not sure. And you might have seen in that kind of infographic I showed, not all species are moving northward. Some are staying, some are moving in the other direction. And that's, again, why it's kind of complicated. And the mechanisms as to like why a fish species would move north versus move south versus stay in the same place, that still is to be discovered. Notice I'm saying that a lot, like people need to study this. But it's a really good question. And I think also people are trying to study those fish which do better with climate change or are more resilient in the face of climate change. People are trying to understand which genes or gene expression is helping them do that, because that might be able to tell them something about the other fish which are not doing that.
All right, great. So we'll move into our last vignette here, and this one is a little bit more about you. So what first got you interested in working with fish, and why did you want to pursue a PhD with fish? You mentioned that you didn't know a whole lot about them before coming to UMass. So what piqued your interest?
Oh, I knew about fish before coming to UMass, just not river herring.
Right.
Yeah, so this is actually, I have to give a really big shout out to my grandparents because they really had a high value for doing kind of educational travel early in life. And so I got to go on a couple of trips like to the South Pacific and the Galapagos, some amazing, beautiful places where I got to do a lot of snorkeling. And I just found that I could sit there and like stare at fish for hours, just doing what they're doing, like flitting around the corals or doing whatever. And I just was so fascinated with them. And that fascination grew with watching documentaries like Blue Planet when I was sick at home or something. And then I think what really kind of launched me into wanting to pursue this as a research or as a career was watching an overfishing documentary, actually. Someone asked about that question. And that documentary, again, it probably was a little bit overblown, but it definitely made me so depressed that I was like, why is nobody studying this? And I can do that. I can, help fish populations and make sure that our world is able to keep them around for our diets and our jobs. So all of those things together made me really want to work on fish for kind of practical, but also sentimental reasons.
Right, and we mentioned in the intro that you've spent quite a bit of time working with our organization, Science Cafe. So can you talk a little bit about how Science Cafe has affected your time at UMass and your career trajectory?
Sure. I remember looking at like the Organizing Evolutionary Biology program website and seeing Science Cafe, that it was graduate student run. And I was like, I want to do that. That sounds amazing. And it really was an amazing experience. I wore a lot of hats in Science Cafe, from like photography to being the president. And I think what it really teaches you as a graduate student is like project management. You have to put on a lot of events, you'll organize a lot of people, and you'll be surprised how much you have to do that in the real world. So don't undervalue that experience. And I also will say that when you're doing Science Cafe, you have to create these storylines around a research area that you're not very familiar about, right? Like, I think a problem with scientists is when we get really stuck in like only our research area and only our research project, and we're not thinking about what other people are doing and why that might be relevant to us or our research. And so when you are kind of forced into thinking, okay, so there's this professor studying this area that I know nothing about, like what would I be interested in hearing about? Because then you're basically putting yourself in the position of being a member of the general public. And you really have to think about storylines and points of interest. And I just becoming a better science communicator, a lot of that has come from being part of Science Cafe as well as other organizations on campus. So another really great thing that I gained from Science Cafe.
That's great. So it's clear that outreach has been a big part of your time at UMass, and recently you won the inaugural OEB Service Award. So congratulations on that. And it's clear that outreach and service are really important to you. So we just wanted to ask, how has diversity impacted your science?
Diversity has definitely impacted my science in that I guess there's like multiple levels. One is that I've been involved myself in diverse things from like what I've been doing as a graduate student, because I think I'm very, I don't know, passionate about a lot of different things. And so it was, I think, very valuable to me to dabble in all of those things, and I gained a lot from it. And I also think that having diverse perspectives and diverse or inclusive research, for example, in fishery science is also incredibly important. You never want like one narrative to be the focus of why you're doing your science and who it impacts. You want to be thinking about everyone who could potentially be affected. And so that's a really big question. So yeah, it's diversity is many aspects, but yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Sure. And one of your other qualifications that we wanted to talk a little about is the American Fisheries Society. So can you tell us a little bit about what is this American Fisheries Society and what is your role as a climate ambassador within?
Yeah, so the American Fisheries Society is a professional society of fisheries biologists, so the people who do the research to understand what's going on with our fish populations and the people that are affected by them. It's an international society based mostly in the United States, and they meet once a year. I have a number of roles with them. One of which is being a climate ambassador. So this is something that I applied to and essentially have been in training to do specifically science communication for just about a year now. So every month we meet and get training from an expert. We do some practice related to how we can implement the things that we learned. And the goal is essentially to be able to develop some products for our professional society to do outreach, whether it's to policymakers, the general public, to the media. We've done some media pitches, some improv. So it's been a lot of fun and has just kind of like added more to that toolkit I have for science communication.
Very cool. Are there any lifestyle changes that you've made to promote sustainable fishing or fish conservation?
Yeah, so I actually personally don't eat that much fish, which I think as a fisheries like person is not a great thing to say, but I do have like this personal guilt for eating fish. And like so many other people eat fish, like I don't necessarily need to eat very much fish. And when I do eat fish, I do want to make sure that it's sustainably caught. And so there are a number of resources online from NOAA and Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they've done a lot of work to look at different fish species and see which ones are sustainable or not. So I often will use those resources to tell me like, should I be eating this? How often can I be eating it? And that's not to say that like you shouldn't eat fish. Fish is an incredibly nutritious food source. and it's, you're recommended to eat a certain amount of fish. It would definitely help our fish populations if you try to eat sustainably and as locally as possible. Just like with farms, eating locally can really be positive in helping with sustainability and stimulating your local economy.
All right, and so we're getting just about to the end of our time, so we'll move back into a Q&A segment in just a minute, but one more question before we do. So can you recap some of the big points that you hope everyone remembers when they leave today's event?
Sure. So climate change.
It's a big question, so.
Yeah, it's okay. Climate change is affecting how many fish are in the ocean and where they are and how they're interacting with us and each other. And so we really need to be advocates and protect that 70% of the world that is covered in ocean and keep those fish populations healthy. And you as a consumer can make an impact by doing that. So we didn't talk about some of the things that you can do, but I'm happy to talk about that if somebody has questions related to it.
Great, that was a great synopsis. All right, so we'll move back into the audience Q&A portion for the rest of our event. We've got a few more minutes here. So if you have any more questions, go ahead and add them into the Q&A part of Zoom. So we have a question here. Give me a moment while I pull it up. So it says, as your study species is not typically targeted by sport fishing, and as such does not feel the pressure on larger specimens being harvested more often and having their grow big genes removed from the gene pool, how do you foresee your research being useful in the future to differentiate between sources of growth/reproductive stressors and other species?
I might have to look at that one.
Sure, yeah.
I'm a very visual person. Yeah, so interestingly, we are seeing that river herring populations are getting smaller over time. So even though they're not being targeted directly by sport fishers or commercial fishing, they are still getting caught as bycatch by fishing boats out in the ocean. And I think it's hard to say why, of course, again, why they're getting smaller over time, but we are seeing smaller males and females, even in the Connecticut River. And that's definitely concerning because smaller fish, they get smaller fish, as you kind of alluded to there. So I think because my research is focused on these principles of how temperature or food availability affects a fish ability to grow, it's a very general kind of research question. It's not only going to apply to river herring. Any other like fish is going to have a similar challenge of getting big and gaining energy. And so while I've really focused on my species, I expect that my results are going to have implications for most other fish out there, which is good. It's a good way to structure your research, that it doesn't only matter for one particular species. So yeah, thank you for that question.
All right, we've got a pretty topical question next. So what are the impacts that COVID-19 has had on the fishing industry?
I probably don't have a very good answer for this, aside from everyone's well aware that the restaurant industry, crashed during COVID. And so that meant that there was a lot of supply and not very much demand. And so I think there was a lot of potential waste, but also attempts at innovation. And for example, I think in Eastern Mass, they were trying to find some ways where they could get oysters out the door so that they wouldn't just waste, a whole year of rearing oysters, but try to get people to eat them, try to find ways to preserve them. And so I couldn't say very easily what the impacts were, but much like most other industries, which are based on like service, so restaurants, dining, they were hit pretty hard.
All right. And then you mentioned just a minute ago that there are some other things that we all could do to help fish conservation aside from some of the sustainable eating practices. Can you talk about a couple of those? I think that would be a great way to wrap up here.
I'm just going to share my screen just so it's visual again. So I mentioned this earlier as be open to trying new types of seafood. A lot of us have biases toward fish that we recognize and know the taste of. And there have been studies out there, including by UMass graduate students, which show that actually people like the taste of other fish species. They just think they won't. So I really encourage you to check out this website, Our Wicked Fish. It's really catered toward identifying local New England fish that you can go out and explore and eat and support our local fishing industry. Another thing is to help advocate removing dams. And this is not meant to be like large dams per se, but many of you may live in towns that have small dams, which have kind of been kept in place because they look really pretty. But just again, imagine being a fish and trying to get upriver. Each dam is another fragmented habitat, another reduction in habitat. And so the most effective dam removals have occurred from towns deciding they wanted to take out a small dam. And so, get in the know of what if your town has any dams and if you can potentially remove them and help some fish find some lost habitat. Okay, the last one probably will take too long, but I'll just mention that there is a Ocean-Based Climate Solutions Act, which helps build infrastructure to do research on climate effects and resilience for our fishing industry and communities to help them deal with the impacts of climate change. So if you can look at this and call your representative to sponsor it, it would be wonderful. Okay, that's it.
That's awesome. Well, Lian, thank you so much for joining us. This was so much fun. I've learned a lot. I am a plant person, so I knew very little about fish coming into this, and I have definitely expanded my horizons quite a bit. So thanks so much for everything, and thank you all for joining us. Our next event will have the same format and will be held on November 18th. So on that date, we'll be discussing backyard biodiversity and human-wildlife interactions with another OEB alum, Dr. Aaron Grade. So check out our website, that's oebsciencecafe.org for more information. And if you haven't already, please fill out the survey that we put in the chat. That would be really important to us, and you can sign up for our mailing list there.
Can I also say really quickly, sorry,
yes.
I see the person who carved this. Eric McDermott is in the audience. See, I used it. He's awesome. He does really amazing fish carving. So I just wanted to give him a really quick shout out. He's on Twitter if anyone wants to look.
Sweet. Well, thank you all so much for joining us. We really appreciate it. This was awesome, and we will see everyone again next month.